The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table. With no intervening action or debate, no further motion to be in order. Any related statements be printed in the record. That President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Further, that upon confirmation of calendar 103, the Senate resume legislative session, and that all after the first vote be 10 minutes in duration.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, finally, one last consent. I ask consent that when the Senate resumes its consideration, and I do appreciate the patience of my friend from Oklahoma. I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate resumes consideration S 1243 on Wednesday, July 31st, the pending amendments be set aside and Senator Paul be recognized to offer amendment number 1739. There will be 60 minutes debate equally divided between the proponents and opponents. That upon the use or leading back of that time, the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the Paul amendment. Further, that no points of order or secondary amendments be in order to the Paul amendment prior to the vote.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. I'm not going to object, but I wanted to ask the Majority Leader, as you know, we've lost a great American, Ambassador Lindy Boggs. Senator Begich and I just wanted 10 minutes on the floor sometime today or tomorrow to honor her. Could we include that in some agreement for tomorrow?
If we aren't able to get it done today, we'll do it and wrap up tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. My friend from Oklahoma.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about a subject, and I also appreciate my colleagues. They're absolutely right. Everything they said in terms of the effect of Obamacare. I was here when that debate took place. But there's two contentions that I disagree with them, and I thought I'd voice them on the floor. One is one of the quotes from the Senator of Texas is you can thank the men and women of the U.S. Congress for Obamacare. I would just say you can thank the Democrats for Obamacare because there wasn't one Republican that voted for it. So it's not the U.S. Congress that did this. It's the President and his allies that created this mess that we're about to experience. The other thing I disagree with is the fact that you cannot design a piece of legislation that will defund Obamacare because the vast majority of it is mandatory spending. So no matter what we did in terms of a continuing resolution, and according to the CRS, which I will ask for unanimous consent to enter in the record and hand this off after I finish what I'm talking about, is all the things that would continue in terms of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act if we carried out the strategy that's outlined by my colleagues. Now, their motivations are absolutely pure. I've never voted for a continuing resolution since I've been in the U.S. Senate. My American Conservative Union rating is 99%. I'd love to defund it. I want somebody to show me a mechanism where we can do that. Because the vast majority of the money being spent today is mandatory spending that doesn't come under a spending bill associated with appropriations. It was passed by law. So the only effective way to truly stop Obamacare, and I think we ought to do it, to stop it would be totally reverse it. We don't have the votes to do that. But we do have the votes to delay it. And when you go out and talk about the fact that they're not going to implement the employer mandate but implement the individual mandate, we can have a vote on that in the U.S. Senate. And then we can have our colleagues go home and say why they think it's fair to do that. We could actually add that. The fact that they're not going to do a check on the claims for eligibility under the exchanges. 88% of Americans think that's wrong. And why do they think that's wrong? Because they know right now on the earned income tax credit that between 25 and 34% of it's fraud. And on the child tax credit, it's the same thing. And they know exactly the same thing will happen when it comes to credits and payments in the exchanges. They also know that the Independent Payment Advisory Board is going to ration care, and the vast majority of Americans, we can have a vote on that again. and a good portion of my colleagues on the other side today would like to get rid of that. So we can have a strategic method of delaying Obamacare by putting the votes up, but there's no way, according to the Congressional Research Service, that the vast majority of funding can be stopped unless you totally reverse the whole bill. And my colleagues said that they didn't think President Obama would sign that. So you'd have to have 67 votes to let that happen. I spent hours on this floor trying to defeat the Affordable Care Act. Many of my colleagues on this side came around other proposals, the Patient's Choice Act, which accomplished many of the same things without the large government, without the tremendous costs, and without the government getting in between a patient and their doctor. And I do have a little bit of experience on that side of the ledger in terms of caring for people for the last 25 years as a practicing physician. So I would think it would be important that we have a way. I don't disagree with the intent of what my colleagues want to do. I want to defund this bill. But I also want to do it in a way that kills it. And there is not a legislative method that we have that is capable of defunding it short of 67 votes in the U.S. Senate, short of two-thirds votes in the U.S. House. Now, can we put some riders on to say you won't implement a certain section of it? Yes. As long as it's associated with discretionary spending. So what I would ask is my colleagues to look at what the Congressional Research Service has said and what the approach will be based on their analysis of a plan. I believe the vast majority of Americans want us to get rid of this bill, this law. They want it reversed. And there's a dissonance between what Americans want and what Congress is willing to give, much as my colleague said. It's different. But to claim the fact, and I'll be with them on not voting for a CR, but it won't necessarily be for the same right reasons. They're good reasons. I think that's a terrible way to fund the government. But the fact is there's a lot of ways that we can delay this bill and accomplish what we need to accomplish. I don't think we can do the other. I don't believe we can accomplish that. And just so my colleagues will remember, it was actually 1996 when we had the government shutdowns, and everybody was all for it till they weren't. And I voted against opening the government back up. And had we held, much like our colleagues want us to hold today, we wouldn't be $17 trillion in debt. We wouldn't have a budget deficit of $800 billion this year. We wouldn't be borrowing $34,000 a second in this government. But I also know human nature. And the very people that say they'll do things today, when it really gets tough, don't do it. So my hope is I praise my colleagues for what they're trying to do. They're right in wanting to try to kill the Affordable Care Act. The cost, the lack of effectiveness, the long-term diminution of the doctor-patient relationship, government involved in every aspect of your health care. But to have a litmus test, if I don't agree with the process, that I don't really want to defund the Affordable Care Act, is not a claim that settles very well with me, especially spending the last 4 years trying to fight this bill. I would say that the administration is lawless in its implementation of this bill. The fact that they're going to pick and choose, regardless of what the law says, they're going to pick and choose what they'll implement and what they won't. I think it's unacceptable. I think it's unfair to the average American. It's certainly unfair to the middle class. It's certainly unfair to those people who are trying to get a job today and can't get full-time employment. We had 334,000 part-time jobs created last year, and at this time in the economy, we should be creating 800,000 full-time jobs a year. They're correct in terms of what it's doing to job creation. They're correct in terms of the negative that it's having on our economy. They're correct about every part of it except the fact that whether it'll actually solve the problem. In contrast to that is what is it that we have done that we can talk about with the American people that's been positive? We've actually shrunk the size of the federal government for the first time since 1995. The discretionary spending in the federal government is going to decline for the first time. And we ought to use the continuing resolution, in my mind, to accentuate that one positive thing is that the reach and impact of the federal government in everybody's lives should be downgraded as well as with the Affordable Care Act. There's no one perfect way to do this. There'll be disagreements. But the fact is we have accomplished some great things with the Budget Control Act and with the sequester. What we need to do is improve on that. When I first came to the Senate, the average individual's debt was $23,000. It's at $54,000 today. Every man, woman, and child in this country. If you're born today, by the time you're 20 years of age, if you count unfunded liabilities, you will be responsible for in excess of $1 million of debt and unfunded liabilities. Let me say that again. If you're born today, by the time you become a majority citizen, you will be responsible for debt and unfunded liabilities in excess of $1 million. The Affordable Care Act adds to that. But it doesn't add much compared to everything else that we've done. We need to rein this president in. I agree. We need to rein the spending in. We need to rein the Affordable Care Act in. If we could end it, I'd be for ending it tomorrow. What we need to do is delay it to where we can get to the point where we can kill it. It does need to be terminated. There are positive things that we need to be doing. There's no question that we ought to make available, without discrimination, health care for people who have pre-existing illnesses. Those are positive things. We can do that. There are ways to do it other than the inefficient, ineffective way that this bill does it. They weren't even ever considered for a vote when we had this. There wasn't any real debate on alternatives because we weren't allowed to offer them in the U.S. Senate. My time has expired, Mr. President, and I submit this, ask unanimous consent that the Congressional Research Study on the effect of my colleagues' plans and what effect it will have on the Affordable Care Act be entered into the record, and I yield the floor in notice of the absence of a quorum.
Without objection. Under the previous order, all post-cloture. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I ask that further proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back. The question occurs on the confirmation of Kent Yoshihiro Hirosawa to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hatch. Thank you. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse.
Yes.
Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Franken, Harkin, Heinrich, Manchin, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Schatz, Udall of Colorado, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Cornyn voted in the negative. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Rano. Ms. Rano, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no.
They're kind of happy. Yeah, they're kind of happy. Right? You can go back to it.
Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Gotcha.
I caught him plenty. I was on it.
Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. McCain.
What do you want? Yeah. I'm pretty sure I can. Check.
Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. No. Mr. Flake. No. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. No. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander. No. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. No. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. No. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts. No. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. No. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Begich. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. No. Mr. Kirk. No. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte. No. Mr. Corker. No. Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch. No. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Soon. Mr. Soon, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, then the ayes are 54, the nays are 44, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to considering the following nominations en bloc, which the clerk will report.
Nominations, National Labor Relations Board. Nancy Jean Schiffer of Maryland to be a member. Mark Gaston Pearce of New York to be a member. Harry I. Johnson III of Virginia to be a member. Philip Andrew Nisamari of Illinois to be a member.
Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Nancy Jean Schiffer of Maryland to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form, prior to a vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the Schiffer nomination.
Madam President, I ask
Senator from Iowa.
I ask consent that that time be yielded back.
Is there objection? Without objection. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Nancy Jean Schiffer of Maryland to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board for the term of 5 years expiring December 16, 2014, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Boxer, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Corker, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, McCain, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, and Warner. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Thune, Toomey, and Vitter. Yes, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss. No.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their votes? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 65, the nays are 33. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to.
Move to reconsider, lay it on the table. Madam President,
Mr. Leader,
do we have attention to the Senate?
order. In the Senate,
We have 3 more votes. They're 10-minute votes. We give 5 minutes penalty time. We're going to start wrapping these votes up. The first vote took 30 minutes. So let's try to stick to what we always said we would do. People wait around here. It's not fair to everybody else. So as soon as we get enough votes here, we can move on. We're going to move on whether everybody's here or not.
thank you, Mr. Leader. Under the previous order, all post